Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and welcome to Flights of Fancy. This is once again the thing I do when I'm not doing horror-related things on the internet, and I decide I want to review fantasy stuff instead, although it does tend to take a tip into dark territory, as you're going to see today. But before I get into my review, I do very quickly just want to give a shout out to a fellow YouTuber who has just started up a YouTube channel that I think is worth looking into. The channel is called The Avid Writer. The Avid Writer does a bunch of different forms of media review in terms of just analyzing storytelling and writing and I guess literary analysis, but it's really across a lot of different mediums, or will be. As of now, the Avid Writer has done parts of a playthrough of Dark Souls 3, I believe it is, and has just uploaded, as of my filming this video, a short book review, and also just happens to be a good friend and a wonderful person. So I highly recommend supporting the Avid Writer. I will try to leave a link to their channel either in the cards up here or down below. But anyway, the thing I'm going to be reviewing today was a first-time watch for me, but is still a story that has long been near and dear to my heart. And that is the 1996 miniseries of Neverwhere. Now, I have read the novel of Neverwhere many, many times. I read it like twice in high school. The first time it was initially for fun and then became a book report. The second time it was assigned as an option. Then I was just like, I'm going to read this again because I'm obsessed with this book. I elected to read it again in college as a part of a creative writing course. I kind of have an academic history with this story, but it's really a story that I keep coming back to by choice because I love it. But I had never watched the miniseries before. An interesting backstory here. The novel and the script for this miniseries were being written simultaneously by Neil Gaiman. So it's not so much that this is an adaptation of the book as it is kind of the same thing in a condensed form as a screenplay instead of a novel. It's not really adapting the novel, it's just kind of an abridged form of the same thing. Because every time the producers or whoever it was who was giving Neil Gaiman orders was like, oh, we gotta cut something, he was just like, all right, I'll just put it in the novel. This is something I'm getting from the intro to the novel, by the way. At which point, they were just kind of like, if you say, I'll put it in the novel one more time, I'm going to kill you. But I feel like he kept doing it because there's only so much you can put in a mini-series and there's a lot more you can put in a novel. But that does mean that this is less of an adaptation and more almost verbatim the same thing, just slightly less of it. But again, Neverwhere is a mini-series that came out in 1996. It was directed by Dewey Humphreys, if I'm pronouncing that at all correctly, who also directed the TV movies Peter Pan Goes Wrong and Are You Being Saved, as well as a bunch of episodes of TV shows, including 6 episodes of Murder Most Horrid. And the show was, of course, written by Neil Gaiman, who has written many amazing novels, short stories, comic books, a million things, but in terms of film and TV, Neil Gaiman has written the TV series version of Good Omens, the original novel of which he wrote with Terry Pratchett, multiple episodes of Doctor Who, and adapted Studio Ghibli Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke into English. And also credited as kind of one of the conceivers of the story, if not the actual writer, I don't really know what that means, was Lenny Henry, who was also in Danny and the Human Zoo and many comedy specials starring himself. So I guess his primary role kind of in the public eye was as a comedian or at least a comic actor. And this miniseries stars Gary Bakewell, who was in multiple films as Paul McCartney because he looks a lot like Paul McCartney. And this includes Backbeat and another movie that I completely forgot to write the name down of, so maybe I'll put that down here somewhere. He was also in a movie called Chef, that's written out as Chef, ! For whatever reason, with Lenny Henry. And First Target, Laura Fraser, who was in A Knight's Tale, Better Call Saul, and Breaking Bad. Hywell Bennett, who was in Percy, The Family Way, and Twisted Nerve. And this stars Tanya Moody, who is in A Discovery of Witches, Star Wars Rise of Skywalker, and episodes of Sherlock. And honorable mention to Peter Capaldi, who plays the Angel Islington in this. I only noticed his name a little later on, but I was pleasantly surprised to see him. But he is the 12th Doctor of Doctor Who, and was also in The Suicide Squad, and was one of the voices in Christopher Robin. And just a little quick thing about this, I was pleasantly surprised when I opened up this case to find a cool little map/poster in here. It is kind of a pseudo map of many of the locations in the story, but it spells out Neverwhere. And it says, "This is the city below the city. A world of monsters and mazes, murderers and angels, knights in armor and pale girls in black velvet. This is London below, the place of fantasy and nightmares. But this isn't a dream. Neverwhere is real." So that gives you a sense of what the story is. However, to be a little bit more specific, this story follows Richard Mayhew, who is just kind of an ordinary London citizen, although it seems like he moved perhaps from somewhere in a different part of England, or perhaps even in Scotland. I'm not really sure. I may fact check myself down here somewhere, but I honestly feel like he has ADHD just because he cannot keep track of all the different appointments and things that he's got to deal with all the time, and he frequently finds himself lost. But one day he is frantically trying to make it to a meeting with his wife. Both of them have like upper crust office jobs, but they are both trying to make a meeting, and one day he runs across the body of a girl kind of just in his path, covered in blood. No one else seems to notice her or to care, but he does, so he picks her up and kind of takes off to take care of her, despite the fact that his fiancée Jessica is like, "If you don't come back here right now, I am breaking off our engagement." And he discovers soon that this girl's name is Dor. She is orphaned because her parents were murdered, and she's trying to escape the assassins who killed her. And shortly after that happens, Richard Mayhew realizes that no one really takes notice of him. And I'm not going to say too much more than that. In case you want to just go ahead and watch the miniseries or read the book now, I would recommend reading the book first, to be honest. But lots of spoilers from here on out, just because I want to get into a lot of the details of things without having to worry about spoiling it. The score of this miniseries was done by the legendary Brian Eno, and he was a former member of the band Roxy Music, who went on to do a lot of solo electronic experimental stuff and really pioneered the genre of ambient music, to be honest, as well as working with people like David Bowie. But in terms of other work scoring things, he has also worked on The Lovely Bones, The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, and Fear X. And it's really what you would expect from a Brian Eno score. It's very electronic, it's very ambient, and a lot of it's just kind of spooky and discordant and really fits with the overall gritty vibe of London Below. And there's a bit later on where the scenes of the floating market are being scored, and it really sounds like a traditional folky fantasy floating market music being played, but like on a Casio keyboard or something. It almost sounds like video game music. But I think that really suits the overall vibe of what Neverwhere is, because it is this fantasy world below London, essentially, that takes from a lot of traditional kind of period-based fantasy things. There's an earl living in Earl's Court. There are friars. There is sword-fighting beast hunters, vampire-like figures, magic, so on, so forth, but it's all within this very urbane setting with a lot of subways and with a lot of, like, really banal, gritty, modern London settings. So that mixture of a traditional sort of fantasy feel with modern electronic music by way of Brian Eno really does fit the entire miniseries quite well. Visually speaking, all of the episodes start with these little segments that are kind of either establishing things that haven't been established yet or kind of speak to things that happened in previous episodes. In the first episode, it kind of looks like it's almost some cheap attempt at a video that Richard's business is trying to make. They're clearly in front of a green screen with like a somewhat cheesy looking map of London behind them. And it's like this, hey, go on, so describe yourself. And he's like, well, hi, my name is Richard Mayhew. Not originally from around here, but I don't get lost in London anymore, definitely. And oh, I collect those little troll dolls and I'm scared of heights. And it's kind of a goofy little, like, get-to-know-you segment, but it does set up a bunch of the things that we wouldn't know about Richard otherwise that are kind of just conveyed in, like, internal monologue in the novel. And then in the later episodes, it just kind of becomes the previously on Neverwhere part. And initially I was just like, oh god, are they going to do this with Richard every time? But they kind of grew on me, and they did start to bring in other characters like Krupp and Vandermeer do one, the Marquis does one. I think those might be the only two who do them besides Richard, but it was fun that they switched it up, and it did kind of grow on me as it went. But like between the cheesy background and like these weird cuts to freeze frames of the characters' faces, like, I guess it was just trying to look surreal and disorienting, but it just wasn't that aesthetically appealing. It did grow on me a little bit as it went on, but at first I was just kind of like, I don't know about this. The actual title sequence to the show itself is really cool. It's this wild collage in a bunch of, like, sepia tones, I guess. But really the best way to describe it, because it is what it is it's Dave McKean's artwork. If you've ever looked at the cover of one of Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, or literally any frame of the movie Mirror Mask, that is what the intro of Neverwhere is. It is Dave McKean artwork in motion, essentially. And I love it. And the characters, initially, I kind of had to get used to just because I've read the book so many times, and I had different visions of them in my head that I kind of had to push aside for the moment to really give the actors their just desserts. But like, I always imagined Richard kind of looking at everything and just kind of being very timid with his voice and just kind of being like, that doesn't make sense. But instead he's kind of very loud and almost abrasive in his delivery of things, which I feel like maybe communicates better in film or TV, but I did always kind of imagine him as just kind of like this guy who doesn't really use his words very well, and kind of like myself in certain situations, to be honest. Just not particularly bold in any particular way, just very soft-spoken and timid, and which there is some of in the character, but every time he opens his mouth, it's a lot sort of louder and out there, more so than I expected. But eventually getting to know the film version of Richard Mayhew, who says the exact same things as book version of Richard Mayhew does, he really did grow on me, and I grew to appreciate him, even though I still prefer book version that I made up in my head. Maybe it's just me, but I originally imagined the characters of Dor and Anesthesia as being younger than they are in this, which maybe they are, and maybe I made that up, but Laura Fraser as Dor is kind of fantastic, to be honest. She is one of the best parts of the show. She communicates this incredible sadness in a lot of moments, as well as some of the best understated humor in the whole show. I love her performance as Dor, especially because she's one of the least zany characters, but still is able to be colorful in these really great ways. And the Marquis de Carabas and Krupp and Vandermeer are kind of as they are in the book as well. The Marquis is very elegant and full of himself, and Krupp and Vandermeer are the incredibly loquacious and incredibly blunt gentlemen who aren't particularly gentle and aren't exactly men either. They are two guys in suits who do the most feral shit you've ever seen in your entire life and are horrific nightmares and also the funniest characters in the miniseries or in the book. I love Krupp and Vandermeer so much. And then when Peter Capaldi shows up as Islington, he's like perfect for that role. He brings the elegance and the gentleness and the eventual sinister and angry quality that is required for the angel who isn't quite as angelic as you think he's going to be. And then I didn't really realize how much I loved the character of Serpentine until I saw her brought to life for this. She's a lot more humanoid than I imagined her, because when I heard the term Serpentine, I was like, oh, she's Serpentine. But her costume is incredibly flamboyant. There's a lot of queer coding, it feels like, going on between her and Hunter in terms of what their relationship is. And she's kind of the monster figure. The children of London below are told to behave, otherwise Serpentine will get them. But, like, she's helping the main characters along their way, and Richard's like, oh, she seemed pretty nice. She's the helpful character who has ambiguous intentions, who everyone else sees as a monster, which I feel like is an incredibly specific description of a character, but is also kind of a type that exists. I don't know. And then some of my favorite acting from Richard is during the Ordeal of the Key sequence, where he's kind of told that he's going crazy and is told to kill himself, essentially, but he has to fight back against it, and you really see this guy who's just kind of been this ordinary British dude bumbling through a fantasy world really stand up for himself, but, like, completely break down and go to this incredibly dark place first. And it's one of the most extreme acting moments in the entire miniseries, and I think he does a really good job with it. I could talk about all of the wild, colorful characters that make up London Below to no end, but I really love the Blackfriars. They're just a bunch of guys, like, they're friars, and they're very solemn, and they're there to protect the key, but at the same time, they're, like, taking these Polaroid photos of Richard before he goes and do the Ordeal of the Key, and then preparing to put his photo up on the wall with all of the other people who've failed. One of my favorite exchanges in the whole show is when Richard just goes, well, lead on, Macduff, and goes into the place where the ordeal happens, and one of the Blackfriars just holds up a little teacup and goes, it's lay on, Macduff, but I hadn't the heart to correct him. He seemed like such a nice young man. It's very subtle humor, but I love it. And then Hunter is very much as she is in the novel, visually and in terms of a character. She is, as her name suggests, her purpose in life is to hunt the great beast of London, and she will do anything to get to that purpose, but she also will serve as, a bodyguard. But in terms of unique things in the characterization that is in the miniseries, I love the way the actress rolls her R's as Hunter. It's very fun. And then there are the Velvets, who are basically vampires. They never call them vampires, but they're vampires. And to really drive that point home, it is delightful that Lamia, who is the Velvet who ends up being protagonist's guide during the Down Street episode, kind of meets up with them at the floating market and is at a curry stand where Richard is, and Richard's like, oh, well, you want some curry? And she just goes, I do not eat curry. And she also makes like a Wizard of Oz reference later, as does the Marquis de Carabas, so it's kind of fun that they're in on pop culture. And I also love that Lamia, while she is definitely in this to drain Richard's life force, she's still a more reliable guide through the world and a more reliable source of information than an angel like Islington, who is deliberately misleading them. She just sees the life force as payment that she needs to take. And I find it interesting that they do feed on like life force and warmth instead of blood itself, and that Lamia's rationale for this is, I need it more than he does, which I don't know if that's true or not. I need to think more about where that line of reasoning comes from, just because I'm interested in the psychology of the vampire characters, if you can't tell. And then on two slightly smaller notes, one of the little kids who they run by in episode 5 is played by Neil Gaiman's daughter Holly, which I thought was cute. And one of the very last moments in the whole show, once Richard has come back from all of the ordeals of everything, is where he pulls out the little troll dolls and he has them go, I am the most dangerous hunter in all of London below. And this one's just like, well, first you must drink the nice cup of tea. And he's like goofing off playing with them on the desk. And the way that this actor does it, again, I'm biased because I've read the book so many times and I've imagined this guy doing the silly voices too many times, but it just doesn't do it justice for me. Like, he's so understated with it, and like I want to see him really goofing off with those voices. Like, do silly voices for the trolls, just don't use your own voice, which is what you're doing. But again, a little bit biased. And then just story-wise, I don't have too much to say because I'm not reviewing the book and I want you to experience the story for yourself. But again, much of the screenplay is just otherwise verbatim stuff that made it into the book. But the one thing I will say for the live action format is it really drives home the feeling of being lost in London via the actual visuals of real London. I didn't know what that was like when I read Neverwhere so many times, so many years ago. But this past May, I did actually go to London for a couple weeks. And my very first night there, I was all too well acquainted with what it was like to be lost in London. And it was kind of the people who fall through the cracks who were the people who were able to help me find my way home. I'm not going to really elaborate on that here, but after being in London, yeah, a lot of this stuff that's in the book and in the miniseries does really hit home a lot more. And I love just the overall themes in the story, which are really about the people who fall through the cracks, as Gaiman has said, the people who are invisible, who are in London everywhere, but other people just won't look at them, or if they do, they will very quickly forget about them. That is juxtaposed with kind of these sequestered rich people just kind of living in their own little bubble, not worrying about them, not knowing they exist. They have a little art opening that Jessica is overseeing in the British Museum, which Dor and Richard have to crash at one point. There are 2 security guards working there who compare the whole thing to Mask of the Red Death, which I think is a really apt comparison. And kind of in that class commentary vein, much like in the real world and in like British society and American society now, everything in London below is transactional in some way. Everyone is exchanging something or paying something, whether it's with a favor or with trinkets, with art, with warmth or life force, with music, but everything has a price in some way, and every exchange, everything that someone does for someone else is in some way transactional, which, yeah, that feels familiar. But it also, in a much more positive light, does help to tie all the story elements together and be like, oh, in order to do this thing, you had to get this thing. And it feels almost like a video game in that way, but also very much like a fairy tale or a myth where this character won't do this thing for you, and till you go on this other quest and get these 3 items for them and bring them back. But all of that is kind of interconnected through all of these different little objects and favors and interactions, and a fun little web that I think is very elegantly crafted. And much like in the real world, that payments and agreement is much of why betrayal and backstabbing happens in the story. And then I love the whole setting of Down Street. Its main function in the story is to let Richard kind of confront his fear of heights, but I love that it's also just like the most gothic setting in the whole story. It's a street that is in the middle of an old, creepy house, and Lamia is their guide through that section, so it really does feel very gothic horror, and I love that. And then on kind of an note, well, for one thing, they kind of mention the gap, but they don't really do anything with it, and that's one of my favorite things in the original, because in the book, they make it very clear that the gap is not just a space, it is an entity, and it is dangerous. I understand why, because they wanted to make this as 6 neat little 30-minute episodes, but the pacing in some of this is so fast that some of the jokes just don't land. Case in point, towards the end, there's a moment where Islington, in a last-minute attempt to get some information out of people, he does his angel thing and kind of shines for a moment and is like, love me, embrace me, follow me, I'm an angel, and kind of shines for a moment and doesn't get a reaction. And then either Krupp or Vandermeer is like, well, that didn't work, on to plan B. But they kind of do it so fast in this that you don't have time to see or really process what Islington is trying to do until the joke is over, and then you're just kind of like, oh, I guess that was funny, but they don't really take time to let that moment happen. If they'd really just let him attempt to shine and just have the characters really sit there for a moment and be like, really? And then moved on, it would have been funnier. But they're just going at such a pace in this that they can't stop for some of the things that the book is able to stop for. And going back to visuals, I think they communicate a lot of the stuff that was written in the story really great. I love how spiky and grimy Krupp and Vandermeer's lair is. Old Bailey's roof doesn't do as much for me. It doesn't look quite as grimy and lived in as I imagined it to, but it did grow on me and I kind of got it more as it went on. Doors associative house where all of the rooms kind of fit together in a weird disjointed stream of consciousness way is very difficult to translate to screen, but they kind of do it in a stage play sort of way with kind of images of rooms on strings at different angles. And then just editing wise, a lot of things in this feel very choppy, especially the moments of the great beast of London dreams that Richard has recurringly. They just kind of happen very suddenly, and then Richard's like, oh, I guess I had another one of those again. It's filmed in such a weird way that it doesn't quite work, and the editing just feels kind of choppy in some ways. And again, that might be my bias because of liking the original book and feeling like the scenes cut off earlier than they're supposed to. But some of the editing felt very choppy to me. And then the Great Beast itself at the end, like, still works great as a function of the story, but honestly, it doesn't look that great. Like, it's in silhouette and it gores the hell out of Hunter, but it still just looks like a little buffalo or something. Like, it doesn't look like the Great Beast. It looks a little bit goofy, but I don't mind that much. But overall, I really enjoyed this miniseries. I'm always going to prefer the book more just because of the things it is allowed to spend more time with, and the little details it is allowed to leave in, and the versions of these characters I have built up in my head over the years. But it was really fun to finally watch this and see these characters interpreted for screen, and see it with Peter Capaldi as Islington, and with Dave McKean's intros and Brian Eno's music was all really fun. So if you've not read the novel, please go out and buy this book. I would highly recommend reading it to almost anyone who's interested in fantasy or genre fiction of any kind. I would recommend doing that first, but definitely go check out this miniseries if you get the chance as well, because I think it is, if not as detailed, just as much fun. That is my review of Neverwhere. thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!